I think that's probably why we haven't seen more of a big deployment and adoption of zero trust as a framework, is that businesses haven't figured out how to balance that in the zero trust's favor, right? Ultimately, businesses have to make money, and revenue kind of wins the day.
Yeah, often I mentioned that, security is not in the business of, stopping anyone or doing, we need to make sure that how do we become that enabler, understand where business is coming from and adopt a lot of these technologies from that mindset itself. How we can become that kind of an enabler towards the business itself,
Welcome to the Cables to Clouds podcast, your one-stop shop for all things hybrid and multi-cloud networking. Now, here are your hosts, Tim, Chris, and Alex.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Cables to Clouds podcast. My name is Chris Miles at BGP Main on Twitter, and as always, I am joined by my lovely co-host Tim McConaughey at OneGoldBez on Twitter. We're still not calling it X. Alex decided to leave the show, so we get to call it Twitter now, and we have no one to combat us on that. So we have a fun one in store for you today. Joining us is Vaibhav Malik. So if you can, Vaibhav, please take a moment and introduce yourself to the audience and tell us who you are and what you do.
Awesome, Chris. Thanks. Thanks for having me over here. And Tim, it's always nice, meeting you as well. So a little bit about myself. My name is Vaibhav Malik. I generally go by VB in professional world. I'm currently working as a global partner solutions architect at Cloudflare, and where my role is collaborating with global partners to design and implement different security and networking solutions for our customers. It's an exciting position. It allows me to be, at kind of forefront of a lot of cybersecurity innovation that Cloudflare is doing in that space. Been in this industry for last roughly around 15 years or so, started a lot in the networking industry, and in the last 5 years or so, have been pivoting into a lot of, cloud networking and cloud security and application security space itself. So I'm based out in St. Louis, Missouri, and would always been a fan of listening to Cables to Cloud podcast, and it's been a delight having over here and talking to you all in flesh and blood.
Awesome, thanks for that. I didn't know you were based in St. Louis. I used to work for Worldwide Technology, so I spent a lot of time in St. Louis at their HQ. So that's funny. Small world.
Yeah. It's always when I travel a lot for work, and a lot of people in the East Coast and West Coast don't understand a lot of the geographical things overall from the central part of the US itself. So we have a pretty nice neighborhood over here I've been here for last 12-15 years, and love being part of the central US overall.
Nice. All right. Well, our topic for discussion today is zero trust. So everyone's favorite security strategy option. I feel like we haven't actually had an episode where we've talked really in depth about zero trust. So we wanted to bring on Vaibhav and kind of dive into this and kind of help frame it, from the lens of what people need to understand about zero trust, and specifically implementing zero trust within the cloud and what that really means. So if we want to get started here, let's say, obviously zero trust is a very big marketing term as well, right? It's kind of stamped on every product out there, but the fact of the matter is zero trust is a strategy. Like I said before, it's a framework that you're supposed to use as guiding principles for how you implement security within your organization. So, how would you yourself define zero trust?
Yeah, Chris. I often say that before AI became the new hype, in the industry where everybody started, having the word AI on top of every other product itself, zero trust, was taking the highest pedestal overall, right? Taking, in everything that we do, zero trust was the front and center, and I think there's definitely a strong need as well when you look at what zero trust entails and what zero trust principles are. The concepts and the philosophies around zero trust are very, very critical, and I don't think we have still achieved a lot of that in the industry on how we do a lot of the IT projects and so on and so forth. Just to let you all audience know as well that I am a big advocate for identity-based trust. I come from a very traditional networking industry, where IPs and IP-based networks were the biggest thing that we did for the 10, 15, 20 years that we have been in the industry. IPsec VPNs, giving access to majority of your network itself. That was it. But I'm a strong advocate, at least in the last few years, that I've been now pivoting myself to cybersecurity and understanding how zero trust is important. For example, your legacy-based architectures, but also in the terms of your cloud-based architectures itself. Overall, just to make sure the audience understands where we are coming from and what we are talking about. Think of this as a fundamental shift on how we look at the overall cybersecurity industry itself. At its core, zero trust is about moving away from what we used to call kind of a castle and moat architecture, where you have a castle model itself, where think of this as everything is inside a network perimeter that we used to think it's safe and it's trusted, right? But that approach overall, if you think about it, right, from a hyper-connected world, it just doesn't cut it anymore, especially in the hybrid cloud distributed world where our applications are all over the place itself. So think of zero trust is basically based upon that principle of never trust and always verify. Again, this is something that a lot of your audience might have heard about this before. So just let's peel the onion a little bit and understand when I say never trust, always verify. So think of this as treating every access, every request, every user, every network as kind of potentially compromised. We take it for granted that it is potentially compromised, regardless of where they are in the network. We used to have, if you remember, right, in the firewall world, we used to have these things called trusted and untrusted. And, now if we have something in the trusted, we trust them, right? So this is basically moving away from that kind of a mindset, that something is either inside your network or outside. So there are a few key things I'll, mention that are very, very critical from the zero trust mentality or philosophy standpoint itself. The 5 of the major ones that I'll talk about are, think of this as continuously authenticate and authorize. We are not just checking your credentials, once at a login. So for example, when you go and log in with your username, passwords, what have you, right? But at the same time, what we are also doing is we are constantly verifying the identity and security posture of your users, your devices, applications throughout the session itself. So that's the number one. Think of this as always continuously authenticating and authorizing the session itself when you're looking at it. The second core principle behind zero trust itself is least privilege access, right? So think of this as users will only get bare minimum permissions itself. Now, this is a fundamental principle within zero trust itself. You need to make sure that they are getting the bare minimum permissions. So if I want to go and access a certain application, that's all I get. That's about it. My user to application behavior is based upon that particular one, rather than, the traditional network-based architectures that we did had. So that's the second one, least privilege access. The third I often say within zero trust is about, a lot of network engineers will relate to it, right? We always did segmentation, but think of this as more of a micro-segmentation, taking that network into small and isolated segments, and we want to make sure that there is no lateral movement that happens, right? If you even happens, to go and access a network, even if a breach occurs, we can limit that particular thing, and it does not allow any of that lateral movement to happen. So that's the number third, which is the micro-segmentation. The number 4, which I often always believe within zero trust that has to be there itself, is always making sure that there is a data-centric security towards it. Now, what does that mean? Data-centric security. It means that we are protecting the data itself and not just the perimeter around it. We have to make sure that data is the most critical for us. And when we are building zero trust philosophies and principles around it, we have to protect the data as well, because that's the most important value for any large enterprise itself. So that's the number 4. There are many others as well, but I'll just probably talk about the 5th one, which I often say within zero trust itself, is about giving the visibility and analytics as well, because we are also wanting to make sure that if we don't have that visibility, the monitoring, we have to analyze the behavior. What's the behavior happening within zero trust itself? Because we want to detect those anomalies as well. So fundamentally, if you look at it, right, a lot of these principles form and come together to what we go and call a zero trust architecture itself. And that can apply to any realm itself. It could be in AI world or your cloud distributed world or in your legacy world itself. That's like you're changing the entire approach towards how you look at designing large networks overall.
I completely agree about the identity piece of zero trust, by the way. I think it's impossible to enforce. You can create policy all day, but you have to tie it to something that's valuable if you want to make it micro, if you want to make it specific to, I hesitate to say user because it's supposed to go further than that, right? But what it's generally thought of when people say the word zero trust, what they're immediately thinking of is user to application type of traffic, right? Let's authenticate our users, give them least privileged access, just like you said, and then continually authenticate them. But the identity we're interested in is the identity of the user. So that's like everybody, when everybody talks about zero trust, that's what they think about. What do you think about app to app zero trust? Like it's a different thing, right? Because it's not the same as identity. Like a user invokes a function, and that function now has to make calls, has to go talk to things. And so the identity isn't the user's identity anymore. Now we're talking like app to app identity. So what isn't that a very different, or is it a very different strategy or policy that you're looking for that?
It is. And, I actually recently, got a chance to write a lot, research a lot about this particular topic, what we call in the industry called non-human identities, right? A lot of these identities are not based upon a certain user itself. Like in a traditional sense, I could have an identity that's tied to me, but now I have these microservices, containers running, and one container needs to talk to another container in a cloud world itself. So, these non-human identities needs to be taken from that same mindset on how do we allow certain APIs to talk to another APIs itself. How do we want to architect the entire solution? And that's where I often say that zero trust overall is not a single product or technology, right? It's building about overarching security strategy and mindset overall in the companies itself. If you think about it, right? If you are a traditional software developer, right, you often would have heard, agile and, things about, how do you become more nimble and, how do you change your software development overall itself. So think of this zero trust as more of a strategy around that. When software development, you have agile methodologies to, build about how to build secure and software design overall. Similarly, in this itself, you are re-architecting your entire approach to security itself. I'll give you an example overall, right? Implement, just give you a benefit that one of the biggest thing that I've faced within zero trust is with the legacy systems overall, right? Where a lot of, our older applications where I used to work, right? And one of the big service providers where the largest of the subset of the technologies that we had were never built with zero trust mindset itself. It was had to do a lot of, serious re-architecting, heavy lift and shift of, making sure that how we can have improved security posture. And the main key aspects around the first initial thing that you need to tackle within that is identity and access management itself. You need to understand what kind of, things, devices that you have, what kind of, entire portfolio of assets that you have. And we really had to, up our game in terms about, multitude of these things, right? It could be getting granular with your access controls or adding multi-factor authentication as well to add to that mix itself. So a lot of these things come into play itself to build upon that. Either it could be user to app or app to app, but things like that.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I mean, as you said, the with the evolution of networks today, obviously that perimeter that was previously kind of well defined has kind of skewed, right? There's no longer this concept of a moat around your castle, right? And you can just assume trust about people that are in the castle at this point, right? So I'm curious from your perspective, like how does that change with cloud, right? So obviously, we had people working from home. Maybe they're coming in over VPN connections, right? You can still kind of, assume a bit about the network connectivity that they're coming from, et cetera. But, with cloud, that being running on completely different infrastructure that you no longer own, right? How does that dynamic with zero trust change within a cloud environment?
Yeah, great question. Implementing zero trust, in a cloud environment can be, both challenging and exciting at the same time, because you are dealing with what you dealt with. Now you can start afresh, right? With the cloud environments, the things are a little bit more nimble and agile. You are dealing with a lot of the newer stack of applications itself. In the cloud, if you think about it, the principles of zero trust become even more critical, I'd say, when you look at it. Right now, we are dealing with things like, for example, shared responsibility model with the cloud provider itself. You have dynamic resources. Now, often you also are dealing with kind of mix of public resources, your private resources. At the same time, when you think about this, your traditional network parameter is essentially kind of non-existent, right? You had a network parameter before, but now you're dealing with a lot of this. So how do you set up a zero trust kind of an architecture within cloud, and how do you enforce it? So based upon my experience, I'll say, first off, when you think about in the cloud, identity becomes your new parameter. You have to think about taking that stance from how you dealt with a lot of the things in the legacy past, but moving into a more identity based model where, even if you, for example, we have to, implement, for example, robust, identity and access management solutions, which can work kind of seamlessly across our on-premises solution or your cloud environments, and things like, single sign-on or multi-factor authentication or adaptive authentication really makes a lot more sense when you are trying to do things in the cloud itself. Now, here, if you think about it, we are not just checking your credentials at login itself. We are kind of continuously verifying your connections throughout the e-session. So in the cloud, when you think about this often means a lot of your security constructs as well. So think of this as your security constructs, like, security groups, for example, your NACLs, or it could be your software defined networking on how you have built a lot of these things. So we are essentially, if you think about it, in the cloud, we are creating a lot of, isolated environments. This could be your VPC within your applications that you have, your workloads, and that kind of limits the blast radius itself, if there is ever a breach, right? So think of that principle when you are building out your architecture within the cloud itself. Data protection, I'll also say, is a very, very critical element as well. So we have implemented, for example, encryption at rest, for example, or in transit. And there are many of the, cloud native key management services that you can build, to take care and control of your encryption keys as well. So when you are thinking of zero trust architectural model in the terms of cloud itself, you have to think about many things, right? You have to think about, for example, your data classification schemes itself. You need to think about will you be able to leverage a lot of the tooling, your legacy based tooling, for example, you had in the past, like your, SIM tools or your UABA to detect any anomalies in real time itself. But one of the biggest critical challenges in the cloud itself is how do you manage your secrets and your credentials itself? Because in a dynamic cloud environment, you can't just rely on static credentials, right? You need to implement dynamic secrets management. You need to understand how do you have those credentials which are generated on demand, and things like that. One other thing I also believe within the cloud environments that becomes really critical itself is the concept of that, what we talked about in zero trust itself, which is the least privilege access. So we have to be really critical in terms of, just in time, just enough access principle when we are building out in clouds. And that also means that how do you leverage, for example, cloud native IAM tools itself, or how do you have things like, for example, leveraging different kind of attributes within the cloud itself, like combination of cloud-based firewalls, your web application firewalls, your API gateways to protect a lot of those resources itself. So things like that, I think, becomes really critical when you are designing within the cloud itself.
Do you think it's I have my own opinion about this. Do you think it's actually easier to work with to set up zero trust principles in the cloud? Do you think things like IAM make it easier than it would be on? In my opinion, there's a lot of tooling that the providers kind of had, since they came later, essentially, since they built it much later, when zero trust was a thing that people were thinking about. There's a lot of tooling that better supports the ability to do a zero trust kind of framework in the cloud than you would have ever been able to do on-prem.
There are tools out there. So there are tools like, for example, your cloud security posture management tools, which give you an understanding of how your posture looks like within the cloud itself. You can also use, for example, tools like, understanding, becoming, leveraging a tool like a broker tool itself to understand how your, cloud security brokers, happen. You could be leveraging Salesforce, you could be leveraging, a distributed hyperscaler cloud itself. So implementing zero trust, I'll say, in the cloud is an ongoing process itself. As your, kind of think of this as your cloud footprint evolves, you have to make sure your security strategy evolves along with it. So what I've actually found is that, given it, you need to have leverage a lot of those controls, the visibility tooling that you do have within the cloud providers itself, that often we never had, for example, in on-premises environment. There are tools that are being leveraged within the hyperscalers, which gives you the access to look at a lot of logs, lot of the tooling itself. So I'll say embracing that dynamic nature of the cloud becomes critical, and taking that advantage of a lot of zero trust principles that you do have. It's also making sure leveraging a lot of the automation based capabilities that are available as well within the cloud environments. That also is something that becomes really critical, right? Enforcing a lot of zero trust policies becomes really, really difficult if you don't have the right automation tools in place. So if you leverage, for example, your infrastructure as code tooling like Terraform or security as code practices, make sure that your security controls are consistently placed, across all the cloud resources itself. That also becomes really critical when you leverage a lot of these. I'll also mention that in the cloud itself, there is important need of having a solid incident response and business continuity planning as well that you have to have. We have to make sure, if there is any, for example, breach that happens, any potential breach that happens in the cloud itself, cloud providers offer many security feature, but the onus is still on us to configure and use them correctly. So we just can't assume that the cloud is secure by default itself. We have to take those controls that we do have and build a strategy around that to build that governing processes itself.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Yeah, I think because with the, from what I've heard, one of the core principles around zero trust is basically always assume breach, right? You want to assume that someone is already inside the network at any given time, and you want to do whatever you can to stop that lateral movement within the environment, right? Just as what we touched on before is, you can no longer trust, an identity just based on some data about where it's coming from, right? If it's within the network, you can't give it implicit access to that. Curious to get your take on privileged access management, right? So that's a common one that I see implemented, where, most operators, are given read-only access to infrastructure, et cetera. And then if they ever want a heightened level of access, they have to use a tool like privileged access management to gain temporary credentials for justification for a change that they need to make or something like that. where does zero trust have a role in that? Is there still inherent danger to giving read-only credentials to a large part of the organization and only giving them, point in time privileged access, or what's your take there?
Yeah, when I say about the privileged access management, right? Think of many of these controls, tying it together, things like, whether that could be your, just in time access or giving granular controls itself. A lot of it, becomes much more critical in case of the privileged access management. We have to understand, all the similar principles that we are talking about within zero trust itself. That could be related to your behavior analytics. That could be related to your zero trust network access itself. In case of privileged access management, what I found is that we have to balance security with usability itself. We have to make sure that any of the strict controls that we do build, because sometimes it becomes the resistance part, right? Where you are like, okay, you are trying to go and achieve zero trust policies, but it comes with a lot of resistance within the enterprise itself, where many of your employees, are at the back end. You are trying to do something, but it becomes a inhibitor for leveraging a lot of this, and you get a lot of resistance within the company itself. Another challenge that I've seen within the PAM itself is that, it has to cover a lot of our assets across the enterprise itself, right? You have to understand in the enterprise, you just don't have, employees leveraging your laptops and things like that. You also have, your BYOD devices, you have contractor use cases as well, where a lot of contractors are coming in. You have a lot of the, devices which are sitting in your data center, but then you also have a lot of the devices which are sitting in your cloud provider itself. So a lot of that PAM needs to cover a lot of that assets, and asset visibility and asset management becomes really, really critical as well in the case of PAM itself. Consistent policies is another important criteria. I'll say it becomes very critical, right? You have to make sure as you're applying a lot of the policies, whether your certain provider is able to apply those policies consistently across distributed space, right? You can't have certain policies being applied in a one hyperscaler, but then you have a totally different set of policies being applied in your, for example, in your own data center itself. So PAM in the zero trust model, the privileged access management isn't just about that technology solution itself, but think of this as majorly a lot of cultural shift as well, because this requires the employees, the users itself who are trying to adopt this technology from that cultural mind shift itself. Training and awareness becomes really, really critical when you are trying to go and adopt that particular solution itself. So things like that, I think, are very, very critical. Whenever somebody is thinking of applying the principles of the PAM within the zero trust space itself. Yeah.
So yeah, you had something that's like really, really important, and it's not just about zero trust, it's security in general, but it becomes, I think, the reason we haven't seen more. Well, it's one of the reasons I think we haven't seen more true zero trust deployments, because I can't think of a single company who's truly embraced and deployed and rolled out a zero trust deployment, like soup to nuts, right? Part of it is probably the pain of having to essentially probably manage multiple zero trust systems, because they have legacy and cloud and God knows what else they have to do it between. There's not one zero trust framework, one zero trust product that's going to cover it all. But I think you hit on the big one there, which is the eternal battle between security and the business, right? Like secure, yes, we need to be secure, but we also need to be able to do business. And the business has an agility problem. It's not so much a problem, except when it comes into, butts heads against security frameworks like zero trust, right? So the business wants to be able to be agile, wants to be able to, perform whatever revenue generating function it has, wants to roll out new products, wants to develop new things. But we want to keep it all secure at the same time. And part of security does involve, throwing up gates, throwing up roadblocks, doing extra checking and just slowing down the process for the process, for the purposes of being secure, whatever that looks like in the framework. I think that's probably why we haven't seen more of a big deployment and adoption of zero trust as a framework, is that businesses haven't figured out how to balance that in the zero trust's favor, right? Ultimately, businesses have to make money, and revenue kind of wins the day.
Yeah, often I mentioned that, security is not in the business of, stopping anyone or doing, we need to make sure that how do we become that enabler, understand where business is coming from and adopt a lot of these technologies from that mindset itself. How we can become that kind of an enabler towards the business itself, often whenever I talk to, for example, a lot of the, folks within the network engineering, how they often relate about how does that relate to me, how does that relate to how I think about, a lot of these processes. And I always say that, let's start from that business mindset itself, business strategy itself, and then relate to a lot of these topics of, a lot of these topics might be technical, but ultimately have that kind of a relevance into the business realms itself. And when we look at it from that policy governance strategy itself, a lot of these things, I think it starts to, easily decipher to the right audience itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, Vaibhav, to your previous point around visibility, and Tim, to your point about business agility. So if we're talking about implementing a zero trust framework in your organization, obviously implementing security just for the sake of checkboxes is going to slow down business, and people are going to want justification for what you're doing, right? So how do you make a zero trust implementation tangible? How do you actually measure things like what you've actually stopped from happening? Because I could say, I've stopped 100 breaches, but it never really happened. So how do you actually measure stuff like that?
Yeah, the metrics is definitely the most critical itself. They can be many of those things from the ones, but I'll mention to you before I move into the metrics part, right? I'll mention that a lot of the things that we do deal with, right, within the zero trust itself are very similar to how we have looked at a lot of the principles in the past itself. So think of this as, when I talked about micro-segmentation itself, right? When I talked about micro-segmentation, that is one of the biggest, probably the biggest change itself. We are not trying to do a lot of the flat network segments itself. We are dealing with not just longer with the similar concepts like, we are VLANs and your subnets and whatnot, right? Now you're looking at a lot of that concepts from, the micro segments that you have built on, right? Also, at the same time, from the traditional network sense itself, you're also dealing with, for example, a lot of east-west traffic itself, right? You're dealing with how do you deal with customers coming in one part of the network, wants to go and talk to another part of the network itself. Many other principles are often tied towards that, whether that could be your encryption, whether that could be your software-defined networking, whether that could be your identity-based networking. A lot of these similar principles apply in the zero trust world itself, right? When you are looking at it. And when you look at a lot of these metrics in the traditional sense, when you have looked at it, also apply into the zero trust world itself. So from the business standpoint itself, we have to also understand, like, are we building a lot of these ground up from the get-go of it, like totally reinvent the entire world, or are there similar principles that we can often take on from the perspective of it? So these are some of the things that I often mention, that really helps towards the implementation and the success and execution of a zero trust project itself. Taking it from the legacy part of it and then building upon that, I think are the most critical itself. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, this has been great. Thanks for coming on, Vaibhav. I think we'll probably want to let's kind of lead this home a little bit. So let's say someone's listened to this, and maybe they have a somewhat of an understanding of what zero trust is, but they don't know how to get started with implementing it in their organization. I mean, what is there some things that you would recommend as how to get started? What are some quick wins, some easy grabs that you can start with to kind of lead yourself down that path?
Yeah. So somebody who is looking at zero trust, right? They need to understand, like, how do we validate this approach, right? We are looking at building this, I'll say, start this entire narrative of zero trust, from, small chunks itself. Like, what is your ultimate goal that you're trying to do and achieve, right? This is a larger project overall. Whenever an enterprise, I've seen in my past experience, starts to build upon the zero trust strategy overall, they generally start somewhere. And when I mentioned before, right, I started with, looking at few of those things itself, looking at, hey, am I using in my enterprise the right tools overall in terms of, multi-factor authentication? Am I using the right tools for managing, for example, my tooling for private access using some identity based tooling itself? Do I have an identity provider which is being, tied to a lot of the SaaS based tools that I'm leveraging as an enterprise itself? From the, ultimate outcomes that you're trying to achieve, an organization's main goal overall is that, hey, how can I go ahead and reduce my risk posture, right? What are the risks within my organization itself, and how can I reduce that attack surface that I have? So within that successful zero trust implementation, we need to understand, regular vulnerability scans that you're doing or attack surface management tools that you're leveraging. You need to understand your mean time to detection and your mean time, how do you respond? And that often generally can be leveraged through a lot of the zero trust principles that we have discussed, right? You get better visibility, you get better automated responses for incident response, for example, right? You want to make sure that as you're leveraging a lot of these tooling, you're building this as to respond to a lot of the threats overall. In other case, I often also mention to a lot of the, architects, engineers, CIOs, CISOs that I often talk to, is think of your organization from a maturity model perspective. Like, where are you exactly on a road to zero trust maturity? What's your maturity life cycle look like within your enterprise itself? Where are you today? Are you at the beginning stage? Are you somewhere in the middle? Or are you towards, implementing a lot of the zero trust within your enterprise itself? Often that maturity model can give you an answer. We for example, have been a very big proponent of building that maturity model, not just based upon one single vendor itself. Right? Zero trust is not being able to achieve just one through one vendor itself, or within like few months itself. It's always an ongoing journey within an enterprise. You're looking at many things, right? You're looking at, hey, as a metric, like you were asking before, right, in your previous question, like what are the kind of things, right? How many policy violations that I do have? Like, are my policy violations going down as I'm trying to imbibe on the zero trust model itself? What's my authentication success and failure looks like, in terms of, my users satisfaction scores? Or am I getting a lot more tickets now with a lot of lateral movement incidents itself? Now that's a critical metric. You want to make sure that there's a decrease in a lot of those incidents, right? Where anything that moves laterally within the network itself, what kind of data exfiltration is happening, any incidents that you are seeing or tracking within the zero trust environment. You want to make sure those are quickly contained, are minimal, and you want to track any of the attempted, authorized, for example, data transfers itself. So a lot of these combination of things, like we mentioned, right? From the compliance standpoint, from the policy violation standpoint, from the user satisfaction scores itself, we want to make sure that a company, adopts zero trust based upon a lot of these. When you start adopting a lot of these principles, it often comes about, making sure that there is some kind of, tool consolidation as well, because often in a large enterprise, I often joke, right? You have 40 to 50 different security tools available, and you can never, achieve true zero trust with leveraging so many of the tools. You want to make sure that, as you are trying to embrace upon a lot of these zero trust principles, it also means that you can think of a lot of these principles from the cost savings perspective as well. How can you, achieve a lot more with leveraging, the security tools that you do have, where you can get a lot more outcome approach from the tools that you are leveraging itself within your enterprise. So these are some of the things that I've definitely mentioned: the maturity model, understanding your metrics, getting a good maturity score on your progress towards the implementation of the zero trust across different domains, I think becomes really, really critical.
Yeah, great input. I appreciate that. All right. Well, Vaibhav, we really appreciate your time and coming on the show today. So if people, listen to the show and want to learn more about Zero Trust and want to connect with you, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I am definitely available on LinkedIn. I'll put my show notes on the show notes itself, my link itself. So LinkedIn is the best way. I'm not on Twitter too much, but LinkedIn is the best way to reach out to me, and more than happy to talk to somebody who is either wanting to move into the zero trust frameworks, looking at a lot of the tooling and technologies from the network architecture mindset, or on the cloud application securities mindset itself, on how zero trust can be taken in small chunks and not get overwhelmed with a lot of the buzzword technology that is being pushed out around the industry. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Yeah, I can't blame you for not wanting to be on Twitter as of late. It's a bit of a cesspool right now, but I digress. All right. With that, we will wrap it up. So thanks for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. If you can, please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Buy our cereal. Tim says that one a lot, and I like it, so I'm going to start saying it too. And with that, we will wrap it up, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye.
Hi, everyone. It's Tim, and this has been the Cables to Clouds podcast. Thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe to us in your favorite podcast catcher, as well as subscribe and turn on notifications for our YouTube channel to be notified of all our new episodes. Follow us on socials at Cables2Clouds. You can also visit our website for all the show notes at cables2clouds.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.